Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffery Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffery Mishlove. Today we are going to look at measuring non-symbolic consciousness. With me is Dr. Jeffery Martin, who is a research professor at Sophia University in Palo Alto, California, and is also the founder and director of the Center for the Study of Non-Symbolic Consciousness. Welcome, Jeffery.
Thanks, Jeffery. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to be with you. And as we discussed before, your research is very physiological in nature. You're looking at many physiological measurements associated with states of consciousness that go beyond the rational.
States of consciousness beyond the rational. That's an interesting way of putting it. So really 10 years ago, I was asking myself, who are the happiest people that are out there? Who are the people that have the most well-being? And I was asking myself that because I'd done a lot in my life, and a lot of those things were supposed to make me one of those people, and yet I wasn't quite there. And I wasn't miserable or really unhappy or anything, but I just didn't feel like I had the level of happiness that, had been promised to me, having done all of the things that the world told me that I should do to get there. And so I really sort of took time off from what I considered my normal life, which was in entrepreneurship and technology and media and things like that. I went back to school. I went to graduate school at Harvard and CIS at the same time, actually, to pick up the skills that I needed.
Harvard and CIS?
CIS. California Institute of Integral Studies.
Oh, of course.
Probably the best qualitative research education that you can get.
Yep.
I thought Harvard was probably the best quantitative education that I could get. So I was really looking to combine those because I thought both of those are going to be needed in order to accomplish what I wanted to moving forward, to really understand who has the most well-being and do those people have something to teach us in terms of actually getting us there?
Yeah.
So 10 years later, that detour in my life has become quasi-permanent. There's not a lot of business or media or technology in my life like there was back then. And we've spent 10 years at this point examining these folks. And
the happiest people you can find.
Yeah, the people that have the most well-being. Happy is a little tricky. People define happy in different ways, and it's one of those words that sort of trips people up. They're like, well, how do I know, that these people are really happy? Or I'm a really happy person, So we use well-being, which has become really normal in the academic world. It's sort of it's a great catch-all word because it defines not just the present moment, but also it's reflexive. And, there's a halo around well-being. Well-being encompasses more of your life than just sort of the hedonic moment.
Well, you have to operationalize it somehow.
Exactly. We had to spend many years operationalizing it. The whole thing was geared in the direction of neuroscience. But if you know anything about neuroscience projects, they often start with 4 or 5 years of data collection before you get to the neuroscience, because I think people often look on TV and they see, an fMRI image or something like that, and the producer has you scroll through the whole image so it looks really cool, on television, and think, oh, this is a whole brain thing. But it's really not. You have to know where you're looking, and you have to know what it is that you're looking for, and that takes educated guesswork and a lot of homework. And so the hard part of a neuroscience study is usually the years that come before the actual scanning work, where you're trying to figure out, what am I really looking for?
Well, I want to come back to the definition of well-being, because from your background at the California Institute of Integral Studies, that's a school that was originally founded on principles of Sri Aurobindo, a spiritual teacher.
Very much so.
You're looking
very prolific.
You're looking at the nature of enlightenment, at least in that world. That's what they would call it, I think. Absolutely.
So after looking across all of these different populations, the one that really stood out to us were people who, and there's lots of different words for this, but people who basically purported to be enlightened or non-dual or persistently mystical in terms of their consciousness, or transcendental consciousness, God consciousness, unity consciousness. There's just so many different terms. We have over 200 terms at this point.
Well, it's interesting that you associate them with well-being, because there was a time, let's say back in the 1950s, when the orthodox thinking, the Freudian thinking about these people is that they are regressing back to an infantile state of oceanic oneness, and it was considered regression in a negative sense, not a positive sense.
Absolutely. There's been so much speculation from both sides of that coin for, you could say, 100 years or more, even going back to William James' time and some of the debates that occurred there, and then through our current time with Ken Wilber expressing a lot of different, perspectives and whatnot. From our perspective, I came into it really skeptical. I came into it not thinking that I was going to be researching people who claimed these types of things. I was trying to get the proper education that I needed to wrap my arms around well-being. So when these people started to kind of flow our way and make the kind of claims that they made about their internal state and the degree of well-being that they experienced, frankly, I didn't believe them. I'd never had a temporary experience of it. I never had a glimpse of it. People used to call me a spiritual turn-up.
But there's a deeper reason not to believe them. I think it goes back to the Tao Te Ching, the classic,
it's a whole other perspective on not believing them.
Work of Lao Tzu, who said, "Those who claim to know the Tao do not."
Right, exactly. So that's tricky because, of course, there is, to some degree, the ineffability of language, right? There's the despair of prose around all of this.
Which is why you use the term non-symbolic consciousness, I suppose.
It is. We had a hard time finding a word that didn't get the door slammed in our face by our early research subjects. And so, we would go to a potential research subject who at that time were basically like famous spiritual teachers and religious leaders and stuff like that, because we didn't have any other way of finding out whether what you were saying was true, right? So we looked for people that were essentially validated by a community, validated by a tradition, things like that, right? So we started on as safe a ground as we could find with this, because what good is research if nobody believes you at the end of it, right? So we had to make sure all the way through that we were really, really careful and really, really rigorous. But, the reality is, of course, that you have to talk about this in order to share it with other people, in order to help people get there.
There has to be a way to communicate.
It's true that you can't, it is beyond symbolic language, and that word non-symbolic really sort of represented this very well with the research population. It comes from a Susan Cook-Greuter paper, who is a great developmental psychologist that came out of the Ed School at Harvard. And she had a phrase in a paper around 2000 that said non-symbolically mediated consciousness. And so we just threw it in the hopper with a bunch of other terms that we were testing, trying to get people to participate in our research. And that's the one that's people, listened for a moment and it didn't hang up on us. And we're like, oh, okay, well, what would you like to, would you like to come over? How does this research thing work?
Well, what it evokes for me is a notion that's common in many spiritual traditions, that when a student or disciple associates with a master, that the teaching takes place at a telepathic level.
I think we've got to sort of get beyond the religious and spiritual and even sort of psi notions of this. One thing that we did was we spent the early part of the research researching 1,200 people. We had a sample of roughly 1,200 people.
1,200 spiritual teachers.
Not 1,200 spiritual teachers. The early days were spiritual teachers. But once we saw very clearly defined patterns in the data, then we were able to reach into the general population. Like, for instance, we wrote a fiction book called The Fourth Awakening, which wound up becoming like bestseller, selling hundreds of thousands of copies or whatever.
In fact, the whole series.
The whole series, yeah. Yes. You're familiar with it, right?
Yes, I am.
And so that first book was written to suck in research subjects from the general population.
I see.
A friend of mine's a great fiction author. It's humorous that I have my name on a fiction book, because I'm definitely not a fiction author. Rod was the fiction author there. But he was able to take some of our early research and stories and stuff that I could give them and weave them into a great narrative that really resonated with people, and then they contacted us. And so we were trying all of these different ways to reach the general population of people. One of the things that I think is most important to realize about our work is that we really spanned across every tradition that you can think of, so religious and spiritual systems. But there's lots of atheists and agnostics out there that also experience this. And so our work was really trying to go to the very heart of this, to ask ourselves, what's common here across all of these traditions? Is anything common? In the academic world, there's a big debate around something called the common core in mysticism. Is there a common core within this? And we really were on a quest, if you will, in a way to answer that question.
It's a big debate. I know it centers around when somebody uses a particular word in one culture, can a person from another culture even understand what they meant by that word?
Exactly. And we got lucky, because we were sorting people for eventual, scanning and EEG work and stuff like that, right? Where we had to make calculated bets on what we might find. And as a result of that, the questioning process that we went into this population with was around the lines of cognitive science. And so I would ask you about thinking, emotions, memory, perception, to some degree your sense of self. And that was very different than everybody who came before us that tried to wrap their arms around this population. They would let that population talk about God, or talk about awareness, or talk about spaciousness, and you couldn't get away with that with us. And so we were able to really cut through all of the different traditions' individual languages and bring them to a central language that allowed us to classify the experience and realize that there were these different types of this experience.
So what are some of your important findings?
Well, for people listening, I think the most important finding is that this doesn't have to be rare. For the last few years, we've had a protocol that really rose out of the earlier research. One of the things that we did in the earlier research, now I come from a technology background, right? So technology, neuroscience, all of that, right? So I was thinking to myself the whole time in the early part of the research, we're going to nail this sucker with technology. We're going to basically zap people's brains, and we're going to have a button, and we're going to get them there. Or we're going to have some sort of neurofeedback, and that's going to get them there. But the problem was when the neuroscience came back, the regions of interest were all very deep in the brain, and our technology really isn't advanced enough for people at home. If you've got a $5 million fMRI scanner with a real-time feedback module, great, right?
But that's a
have one of those at home,
Deep in the brain, you're talking, I mean, the deepest would be the brainstem.
Yeah, and there are changes, actually, that do go that deep. It's primarily networks that sit above that.
The limbic system.
In recent years, there have been a couple of sort of meta-networks that have been talked about. One network that turns on when you're doing something, when you're really sort of working on something. It's called the task network. Slang for it is the task network. There's neuroscientists like to call things by 50 different names, right? It's one of the annoying things about neuroscience. But you can find it online if you search for it as a task network. The other one is the default network. And over time, it seems to have become clear that the traditional sense of self is really strongly mediated in some way by the sub-networks in the default network. And the issue with the default network is that its primary nodes we initially saw changes in activity in sort of deep in the hemispheres here and deep between the hemispheres back here. Well, the skull is especially thick back here, so that's very difficult to get stuff through. And so it was just one of those things. But here's the deal. In our research, one of the things that you had to fill out, in addition to zillions of other questions, was a question that said, hey, how'd you get there? And it turns out that how people got there was not that diverse. That there was just when we sorted on that data, which was after we'd kind of given up on the technological side, right? It was going to be another 5 years or more for the technology to roll out. So we went back to our data and said, well, what else is in there that we wanted before and after data, right? I mean, you can't tell if somebody is going to have this transition and rush and collect data on them. And so we had to, in the lab, be able to generate a situation where we could have before and after data. And so we went back fishing in our data for that, basically. And that's where we found, we'd asked these people, maybe there's, maybe this isn't as subjective,
Before and after achieving a state of high well-being.
Yeah, what we call ongoing or persistent non-symbolic experience. Ongoing is if you've experienced it less than a year. That's a term that we've had to use for the last couple of years because we're now able to get people there fairly reliably. And persistent was the word that we've used throughout the 10-year period.
So you're not just measuring,
which is more than a year.
You're helping people to achieve these states.
We are, yeah. In the early days, like I said, I was very skeptical. I thought these people were probably delusional, or either self-delusional, or maybe they were deceptive. Maybe they're just trying to deceive others based on a canon of literature that had been built up over time. I didn't know, but it didn't take too many years for me to become convinced that this was something that was really powerful. And I think of it this way. In most people's lives, there's this fundamental problem of the human condition, right? So you think of it as this, from a psychological standpoint, the fundamental problem of the human condition is really that evolutionarily we've been built up to have a psychological foundation that's around things like fear and anxiety and scarcity. And those things make a lot of sense,
right,
because, genes take hundreds of thousands, even over 1 million years in some instances, to really sort of catch up, right?
Yep.
And so in many ways, we're really wired for tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago. Well, you could, if you lived in the wrong place, right, you could very easily starve before you made it to the next berry bush, right? You were constantly looking around for predators to, that were going to eat you or that were going to kill you, right? You get a little paper cut, you get a little cut, right? And that could become infected and kill you. The world was a dangerous and uncertain place. So it made a lot of sense for our deep psychology to have as its foundation these things like fear and scarcity, and that's just helped the human race survive. But sitting here right now, I mean, are you worried about a wild animal killing you?
Not at all.
Me neither. Are you worried about, the production crew killing you?
No.
Right? I'm not either. I don't know them as well as you do, but I think I'm pretty safe, right? If you're like me, you're probably trying to lose weight, not gain weight, right? So you're not worried about scarcity. You're not worried about starvation. Basically, we're wired for the wrong period in time. Now, probably not the whole world. There are probably still populations of humanity that's still an appropriate wiring for.
All too many.
But for you and I sitting here today, for most of the people who have access to YouTube, these aren't their problems.
Right.
And so what happens with this shift to non-symbolic experience, to a persistent or an ongoing form of non-symbolic experience, is really a substitution at that deepest level of one's psychology, away from those types of things and towards a sense that everything is fundamentally okay, towards a sense that you don't have, the scarcity goes away, the worry goes away, the anxiety goes away, and it's basically replaced with a sense that you feel complete, that you feel whole. You're not constantly out there trying to buy the next car or make sure you're wearing the right shirt or whatever it is, because, that will be the thing that makes you whole in other people's eyes. And
well, back in the 1960s, Abraham Maslow wrote a book, Toward a Psychology of Being, which he talked about the shift from dependency consciousness to being consciousness. That's what you're talking about.
And in the later part of Maslow's life, which is not very well known, if you search on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you come up with the version of it that was dominant for a very long time. But towards the end of his life, he came out with a new version. When he realized he added a whole level, right? Okay. So he added a self-transcendence level. He realized, and Cook Greuter did something very similar in the academic world later with one of their major developmental measures. He realized that there was this sort of inside his idea of the sort of peak experience, right, of the peak transcendent experience, which was so instrumental to his work. He realized that he was at that top level of development that he called self-actualization, where these temporary experiences occurred. But there was this paradox that was unresolved, where how could self-actualization be the top of the pyramid if the key parts around self-actualization involved actually transcending that self-actualized self in the first place, right? And so he added a whole other level onto his pyramid. But he had severe heart problems at that point. He was not able to be as communicative. And those ideas did not really spread from his later work. Incidentally, towards the end of his life, he was on a panel, and you've probably interviewed Stanley Krippner at some point over the years.
Stanley Krippner will be here in 2 weeks.
Oh, great. So Stan, when he was a young researcher, was on a panel with Abe Maslow. And Abe basically was talking about the difference between the peak experience and the plateau experience. And his plateau experience is another word for our persistent non-symbolic experience. And God loves Stan because as a broke young assistant professor, he pried the sixth sense that he had out of his pocket and put it down on getting a transcript of Maslow talking about his own shift into this plateau experience and the differences between it and how, what an amazing place it is to live from and whatnot. And it's really the only record that we have of that. So
I see. I met Maslow.
I bet. Yeah, you've been at this for so long.
Back in 1969, as soon as I finished my undergraduate years in college, I came out to California, and Maslow was the first person I wanted to seek out.
Would have been me too. Yeah, absolutely. He was so rigorous. He was such a wonderfully rigorous scientist.
So, how do you bring people into this state of beingness? I mean, you're very convincing. I feel like I'm getting a buzz just talking about it.
Yeah, fortunately, I'm no longer the turnip that I once was. Right around 2010, I thought to myself, our research has really progressed enough. There are enough people working on this around the world. If I get hit by a bus tomorrow, this is just going to keep going. This research is just going to keep going. Yeah. And so I had not really allowed myself to have a transition because I know that there's a bias inherent in this consciousness. That one of the things that goes with this shift in your experience is that there's a fundamental sense that you really understand things in a more complete way. And how that shows up is different depending upon the place that you're at within the experience. And as a scientist, I recognize that could potentially bias someone. And so I held myself at bay from this for quite a while.
Scientific purposes.
But then I really became the first successful person of the protocol that we use to shift people.
So you have a specific protocol.
We do. It's called the Finder's Course Protocol. We occasionally run experiments. The last one started in October. I don't want to make this video, dated or anything like that. So I won't talk about dates any more than that. But we have another one coming up in another few months. And with each one, we basically try to add to our data pool. So right now we're adding to it with physiological measures. And so we're having people monitor their brain waves and their heart rate with very simple consumer devices, their skin conductance, across thousands of people basically that can participate in these experiments. And so about 73% of people in our experiments reach an ongoing form of this in 4 months. It's a 4-month protocol. A
persistent state of non-symbolic consciousness.
Right. We call it ongoing until they've been in it for a year. Then we call it persistent.
Okay. Ongoing and then persistent. And let's define again what you mean by non-symbolic consciousness.
Absolutely. So I think the easiest way for people to understand this is that there is this fundamental shift in the baseline of your psychology. And as you know, the way experience is built up in the brain, it's really hierarchical. Basically the brain was added onto over the years, right, of evolution.
Over the millions of years.
Over the very, very long time frame. We don't get, your kid doesn't get a new lobe or anything like that. So this is something that happens over a very long time horizon. And so different parts of the brain are sort of layered one on top of each other. So being able to affect the foundation has a profound effect on your experience because your other experience is essentially constructed on top of that. And so the common ways that we describe the experience to help people understand it, to us it's not a mystical thing, to us it's not a spiritual thing or a religious thing. We feel like we reached the core that stripped out a lot of that dogma. And so you essentially have that profound shift. You feel safe, you feel whole. You feel like everything is okay, but in a functional way. If you were to pull a gun on me, I'd still be able to react to that. I wouldn't be like, oh, everything's okay. He's got a gun. Look, he's going to shoot me. This is great. Everything's okay. So you're highly, highly functional. Your mind is clear of self-referential thoughts. Most of the thoughts gumming up our head are thoughts about ourselves, right? Geez, what's Jeff thinking of me right now? Am I sitting properly for the camera? Should I have worn the white shirt? We have all of these, and those are obvious ones, right? But what's less obvious to us is that really so much of our cognition is tied up in self-referencing thoughts. And one of the things that happens is there's a shift away from that type of thinking. And that leaves you with this mental apparatus that is so clear and has so much space in it. You're so much more powerful. People in the spiritual circles have for a long time said you go from your mind being your master to being, from your mind being your personal master to your mind now being your servant. Well, I think this is the cognitive science way of saying that. When you clear out all of that junk and it's just not there. There's changes in emotion. And so you have a change to increasingly positive forms of emotion and negative emotion dropping off very, very rapidly. Really, as rapidly because you're not perpetuating the stories with the mental junk up in your head, right? And so that you're not perpetuating the negative emotions associated with that either. And so really, as soon as the biochemistry falls off, so does the emotion. There's not, you're not there sort of driving it forward with stories. And so there's tremendous benefits that are very simple for people to understand that come from this. I think people hear words like enlightenment or non-duality or stuff like that, and they think it's woo-woo or they think it's something. But this is an incredibly. We think that this is probably coming in to humanity at a time when it just makes sense.
Well, it sounds like what you're describing is what Maslow referred to as self-transcendence.
It is, from his plateau experience. Exactly. And the difference between the peak experience and the plateau experience was essentially the energy level. So one of the things that he talked about in that fantastic piece that Stan had transcribed is that, in the peak experience you have a lot of arousal in your system. And it's difficult for people that have a really profound temporary experience to imagine how they could operate in daily life from that place, right? But in the plateau experience, it's a very peaceful place. And so it's opposite in many ways. And Maslow called it, he called the plateau experience in that, on that panel, what your moment to moment looks like if the mystical experience really takes hold. And so
high energy but tranquil at the same time.
Yes, it's such a remarkably peaceful place. I used to be this sort of classic type A, person who was always stressed out and just so caught up in my own thoughts and so caught up in my own stories and all of that. I had no idea what a moment's peace was, right? Now that was great. I achieved a lot. You can say there's benefits to being in that mode. On the other hand, we've achieved a lot from being in this space as well, right? So people often worry, what do I have to give up to experience that? Because they'll hear the spiritual people talking about how you have a shift in your sense of self, right? You go away, right? And that just terrifies people because they've spent their whole life building up who they are, and they're like, I don't want me to go away. Like, if I go away, what does that mean? What are the implications?
Or conversely, maybe they don't want me to go away because they haven't developed a me yet.
I think most people have developed a strong me. There's just a couple of things that I like to leave people with. And the first is that you don't have to have that fear. And so, the way this has been talked about in only some forms of religion and only some forms of spirituality, you don't see it across all of them. But the way that they've chosen to language some of this, I think, is not very helpful from the standpoint of our Western developed minds, because we've spent a lot of time cultivating our individual sense of self, and we're very vested in it. And if you want to sell somebody something, right, you just have to appeal to that sense of self. You have to you have to say, I'm going to make you more powerful, right, or I'm going to make you more whatever, right? Everybody's looking to add something to that sense of self. Well, this, you're still dressing the same, you still like the same food, you still have the same hobbies. Those things don't have radical changes on the other side of this. The difference is that you go from having a kind of a fundamental discontent that's always there, always having your mind saying, well, if we just got this, maybe that would do it. If we just got this other thing, maybe that would do it, right? And how many of those things over the course of your life have you successfully gotten? I got a lot of them, right? And it didn't make that much difference to me in terms of my overall well-being. You've probably had the same thing. You've had this amazing life. And I think most people out there are far more successful than they realize they are, and it's because their brain is constantly saying to them, let's get this next, okay, that thing didn't do it, let's get this next thing, right? But people have accomplished so much in their lives, but they haven't found that fundamental sense of contentment. There's always that discontentment that's sort of driving them forward. And this provides that fundamental sense of contentment, but not in an unhealthy way, not in a way that makes you not functional in the world or anything like that. Again, you have the edge cases of the spiritual teachers, right, who lots of times they were severely depressed or something just before they had a shift into some form of this. And so they weren't psychologically healthy before it. They had some sort of psychological pathology before it that played itself out after it. But they're the ones who they had such a profound shift in their well-being that they go out and tell the world about it, right? So it's their stories that sort of propagate through culture. In the meantime, there's millions of people who are living with this, that, people that are running countries and Fortune 50 companies, all the way down to, programmers in Silicon Valley and janitor in your local high school. There's a whole range of demographic. The entire demographic is embraced by this and experiences this, but they don't change their lives and write books and go talk about it and whatnot. So I think people are often sort of put off or a little freaked out by these edge cases that have become so popular.
Well, Jeffery Martin, we've run out of time, but this has been a great conversation. High energy and tranquil at the same time. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you. It's a true honor.
and thank you for being with us.